In The Gilded Age, for example, Julian Fellowes' most recent TV show is about the New York Supper Society in the 1880s. This historical drama is based on real events, like the building of the Metropolitan Opera House, and shows a fight between old families and new money that existed at that time. One famous family, the Russell family, is a lot like other rich people who got rich around the same time. The Vanderbilt family, on the other hand, got rich around the same time. There are a lot of similarities between the two families. Even though they are both made up, the show has already talked about the real family, so you know they are not exactly the same wolf. Families went through similar things. The Russell family was influenced by the Vanderbilts as they moved into New York society and made money in railroads. However, since the Vanderbilts are imaginary, the Gilded Age has the freedom to go its own way when the story calls for it. Though, this isn't the fault of the show's writers. Laziness, because they don't think twice about showing accurate recreations of historical people, even though the stories are made up. The Gilded Age cares about being accurate, from the more complex historical figures shown on the show to the bigger problems facing society, though there is definitely some artistic license used for some characters. Manny of Fish, Ashley Ainsworth High, Clara Barton, Linda and Her, The White Stanford Theodore Sanders, Dear Mrs. Astor Donna Murphy Ward, Mother, the name Nathan Lane Fortune T. Thomas Jones, Kristen, Sullivan and Nilsson, We're Real, Sarah Joy Miller. The connections between these characters and their real-life peers get more interesting as some of them become more important in the show, even though some of them are only minor characters. All of them show how true the Gilded Age is, which is what the wide-eyed, a young person from a conservative family is to join the wealthy clan next door, which is run by George Russell, his ambitious wife Bera, and their cruel son Larry. During the Gilded Age, Mrs. Caroline Astor is the official head of the aristocracy, and Russell Cree is determined to get Mrs. Astor's approval, so that he can fully join society. Mrs. Astor initially doesn't want to give in to the other woman's wishes, but she has to in order to give her daughter Carrie an invitation to Russell's ball. However, the two women end up on opposite sides of the opera fight. Caroline Webster in reality, Mrs. Astor was very much the same person she controlled in New York society at this time, eager to keep the old families in power. However, Mrs. Astor used her strength to become head of the family and keep the aristocratic society together during rough times. In the end, Mrs. Astor's cause was lost. She set an example for the rest of the elite by keeping the new rich at a remove. She was famous for her fancy balls and private dinner parties. But just like in the show, she fought to keep upper society from changing. Among other things, she ran into problems. As Vanderbilt was determined to become a member of the upper class, Alva really had a falling out with Mrs. Astor. She is a lot like Bertha Russell. The only difference between the show's version of Mrs. Astor and the real Mrs. Astor is that Mrs. Astor's opponent is Bera Russell instead of Alva Vanderbilt. In the show, Mrs. Astor's loyal friend Ward Mullister is torn from history and stands in for Bertha's way into society because she needs to get to Mrs. Astor's level. Even though he is Bertha's friend in the South, this guy will always be loyal to Mrs. Astor. The most famous thing about the real Ward Mullister is possibly that he came up with the word 400 to describe New York's upper class. He said that society had about 400 people. He met Mrs. Astor while making the guest list for one of her parties. But this was after the events of the show, since the Gilded Age shows that he was close to Mrs. Astor and spent most of the 1880s in Newport. In addition, the former lawyers set up the patriarchs, an order of family heads who could let anyone into the York's elite. In a different part of the show, the number of historical characters who can be used in the story is increased. Scott Den Benton goes after her because she loves writing. She meets T. Thomas Fortune, the editor of the New York Globes, publishes her story and tells her she should write more about politics. The two continue to work together because Fortune says Peggy's writing brings more people to the paper and gives her other writing chances. Still, Fortune is best known for his politics, which aren't talked about much on the show. As a child of slave parents in the 1850s, Thomas Fortune spoke out strongly for civil rights. He knew firsthand the problems Black Americans faced. He helped start an early version of the NAACP, which became the Afro-American League. During his career, Fortune owned and edited 3 newspapers: the New York Age, the New York Freeman, and the New York Globe. This gave him a big voice, and even though they had different political views, he kept a close relationship with all of them. The character M. Fish is not as well known on the show, but he is a unique person who became famous for having strange parties. She has a doll tea. People who come are given toys for the event, and she then asks Glades, Tessa Farmiga, and Larry Russell. Harry Richardson will be there. Mama Fish might look like the perfect character, in order to add some humor to the story, but her strange habits are real. Even though not much is known about her, she was known for her fancy parties and sarcastic sense of humor. During the Gilded Age, women were seen as unique and didn't make many shows. In the TV show, Stanford White is the architect who designed Russell's luxurious home and helps Lar in his quest to become an architect. The real Stanford White was an architect who started McKim Meat and White and made it one of the most prestigious architecture firms in the country. They built the Astor Residence, Judson Memorial Church, Washington Square Arch, the second Madison Square Garden, and a house for the Vanderbilts, which is another thing they have in common with the Russells' Brutha. Russell asks for a show to impress her. People at her party for opera fans. Kristen Nelson, a famous soprano, shows up to perform a piece from the Metropolitan Opera House's first season. Everything that has been said about her is true, even though she only sings one song in the play because of the Gilded Age themes. Christina Nilsson was one of the first people to play Marguerite at the Met, and her work helped the show become a hit. The attention to detail and the use of historical people in even the smallest ways show that the story is real. Include real people from the Gilded Age to make it feel much more real at every turn, and shows that sometimes the truth is just as interesting as fiction. The show does more than just draw from history.